Hi, and welcome to Tea and Strumpets, a Regency romance review. I'm Zoe.
And I'm Kelsey.
And Kelsey, today we are reading a book that I've been wanting to read for the podcast since it began. So I'm just so excited to get into our discussion because I do not know your thoughts on this book at all.
Well, what was really fun, Zoe, is I have read every other book in this series except this one for some weird reason.
That is super cool because I also do want to talk briefly about the third book in this series. This is book number 2. Mm-hmm. So, okay, that's going to be fun. Good to know that you have read them because, there's just so much to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I own 3 of them, 3 of the 4. And for some reason, I was missing this one, so.
Interesting.
Now I have the complete set.
Well, do you? Because there's 2 novellas.
Well, I have at least the one novella. That's for sure.
It's true. All right. And the book we are talking about today is The Heiress Effect by Courtney Milan.
Yes.
And that is book number 2 in the Brothers Sinister series.
Mm-hmm. And this is a fun one. But first, it looks like we have a history fact.
We do have a history fact today. We've talked about Courtney Milan before because we have done 2. Sorry, I was thinking we'd only done 1, but we've done 2 of her books before. So I don't have an author fact, but I do have a history fact. This book kind of centers around one parliamentary bill that is a real bill. And it is the Reform Act of 1867, more specifically, the Second Reform Act of 1867. So for a bit of history, the 1832 Reform Act proved that change was possible. The parliamentary elite felt that they had met the need for change, but among the working classes, there were demands for more. The growth and influence of the Chartist movement from 1838 onwards was an indication that more parliamentary reform was desired. The Chartist movement had peaked by the 1850s, but there was an acceptance among members of Parliament that there was more work to be done to remove anomalies in the system that the first Reform Act had not addressed. However, the call for universal manhood suffrage, or, quote, one man, one vote, was still resisted by Parliament, and the Second Reform Act, passed in 1867, was still based around property qualifications. So if it isn't clear by now, these Reform Acts had a lot of different things encompassing them, but were really centered around voting rights. So there was no question of campaigning for the right to vote for women too. However, they were still excluded from all of the bills that we are mentioning today. The 1867 Reform Act granted the vote to all households in the boroughs as well as lodgers who paid rent of £10 a year or more and reduced the property threshold in the counties and gave the vote to agricultural landowners and tenants with very small amounts of land. Men in urban areas who met the property qualification were enfranchised, and the act roughly doubled the electorate in England and Wales from 1 to 2 million men. So, although not perfect, shall we say, it was a big step in the right direction, doubling the amount of people who were able to vote. And our hero in this story is in the trenches with the Reform Act, so to speak.
Yes.
So I don't know if you saw this, Kelsey, but there is also a fabulous author's note, which is at the end of the book. Did you read that?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay, fair enough. But it was really interesting. It goes into detail about this, more so than what I said, and more specifically into how the events in the book relate to this act. Anyhow, it's very specific. And other issues which some of our characters deal with are also in the author's note as well, including racism and disability information specific to the characters in this book at the time. However, it also does include a link to an article from May 7th, 1867, where the issue of the Daily News has a, quote, surprisingly sarcastic account of the rally that our characters attended in Hyde Park. And I highly recommend listeners that you take a look at that, which I did. I was going to put it here in the notes, but it turned out to be a little bit too long. So as always, we will, of course, link to that in the show notes.
So today our main tropes are opposites attract and, but we just can't marry each other.
Yeah, there's like, I was trying to define this one because it's such a trope. Like we see this all the time. Like the characters both know that they can't marry each other from the start of their interaction. They're like, we are not able to marry for X, Y, or Z, or just X, whatever it is. And they're both like very clear with that. honest and open about it. But of course, love is going to get in the way.
Yeah, that chemistry man is a real zinger.
And our main characters today are Mr. Oliver Marshall and Miss Jane Fairfield. So, Kelsey, shall we get into our synopsis?
We shall. Jane Fairfield is known as the Feather Heiress. This is not because her money comes from goose down, but rather to spend an evening in her presence is like being beaten to death by feathers. The first time she had heard that cruel analogy, she had been slightly disheartened. But then she realized she could use that to her advantage, and so she simply weaponized it.
Oliver Marshall is the bastard son of a very cruel duke, raised by a very caring mother and father. His whole life, though, he's had to fight for everything he's done, but now he does it much more shrewdly than with his fists. Instead, he is a political rising star, bridging the gap between the ton and the common man, biding his time, making connections, and begetting favors, waiting in the wings for the perfect time to step out into the spotlight.
And Oliver can feel that this time is rapidly approaching. If he can persuade Bradenton, and therefore Bradenton's cronies, to vote for the reform bill when it comes up again, he will be credited with its success, which will be a huge boon to his political clout.
It is at a dinner at Bradenton's that Oliver first meets Jane. He is forewarned with the token, quote, "It's like being beaten to death by feathers" by the other gentleman, but isn't ready for the full effect of her. Quote, "But looking at her was like picking up a luxurious peach and discovering it half taken over by mold. Her gown was ghastly. There was no other word for it. Even that one scarcely did justice to the thrill of helpless horror that traveled through him. A little lace was in fashion. Falls at the cuffs, perhaps, or a few inches at the hem. But Miss Fairfield's gown was lace all over, layer upon layer of the most intricate hand-knit stuff available. Black lace, blue lace, gold lace trim. It was as if someone had swept into a store, ordered 300 yards of each of the most expensive kinds of lace, and then crammed every L on one dress. This wasn't a case of gilding the lily. If there was a lily underneath all that, it had long since been crushed to a pulp. The party stopped in its tracks as she took off her cloak, frozen in wordless contemplation of a wardrobe that made the word gaudy sound sweet and demure by contrast.
But Jane doesn't seem to notice anyone's stares or any awkward silence ever. She is a battering ram of overconfidence, finding no issue with making any sort of social faux pas. She speaks too loudly. She flubs up names and titles. She hands her coat to a guest, not realizing he isn't a servant. In fact, she is so airheaded and completely unaware that she is the butt of jokes throughout the night. Of course, this is all an act. Though at first she did make many faux pas when she first entered society, Jane decided quickly that with just a bit of exaggeration, her flaws could become the perfect defense she needed. Because she has well over 400 days that she needs to keep up this facade. She has to remain unmarried until her sister comes of age to keep her safe. And a £100,000 dowry was too attractive a number to keep away most men. She couldn't simply be ugly or dowdy or irritating or vapid. She had to be unconscionable, absolutely unmarriageable, while at the same time being perfectly marriageable enough to make her uncle think that she was at least trying her best. So she played into her faults because at least she was good at them.
Unfortunately, her facade was built to crack under men like Oliver. Men who try to be nice were the most difficult for her. Quote, "Poor Miss Fairfield, she had the opposite of good conversation, the opposite of taste. They were going to rip her to shreds, and Oliver was going to have to watch. It didn't matter how irritating Miss Fairfield was. Oliver had been on the receiving end of those snide comments one too many times to rejoice in making them."
After their first meeting, Jane told her sister, quote, "He was quite determined to be kind to me, and he was funny to boot. If I'd let him talk to me much longer, he would have made me laugh. I had to break him before that happened. He had the strangest expression on his face near the end, solemn and brooding, as if he wanted desperately to like her and was upset at his own failure. Jane wouldn't feel safe until Marshall was actually laughing with the others. She was almost going to regret breaking him. He'd been nice."
Oliver and Jane are about to be thrust together, though, because Bradenton issues Marshall a challenge that evening after the women have taken their leave. It seems that Jane has provoked Bradenton one time too many, and he wants her humiliated. If Oliver does that, he will provide his vote for the reform bill. He tells Oliver his terms as a newly minted Earl, Hapford, watches. Bradenton has taken Hapford under his wing to show him the ropes of politics. And this is his first lesson. Quote, "You see, Hapford," Bradenton said, "he wants, I have. The only way to make a deal is if I want something, too." He leaned forward. "And what I want, Marshall, is Miss Fairfield." There was no masking the venom in his voice. "I don't want to see her or her annoying gowns. I don't want to hear her thoughtless jibes." Bradenton's nostrils flared. "She's the worst of the worst, a woman with no birth to speak of, who thinks that her £100,000 makes her my equal. A woman like her, running about spouting her tripe, she does damage to us all, and I want her gone." "That's not going to happen," Oliver said sharply. "I don't ruin women, no matter how annoying they are." Hapford was looking between them, his eyes worried. "Well said, Marshall." Bradenton seemed to come back into himself with one long, slow breath. The hatred in his eyes dimmed to mere amusement. "Oh, look at you two. Ruin her? Goodness, how sordid. I wouldn't ask my worst enemy to kiss her." "Then what are you asking?" The Marquess leaned back in his seat. "I want her to know her place. Humiliate her. Hurt her. Teach her a lesson. You know how it's done. It took you long enough to learn yours."
Oliver sits still, and Bradenton tells him not to answer, but to work through his principles on his own time. Quote, "It's one annoying girl against your entire future, against the future of voting rights." And although Oliver hates himself for it, he stays quiet as he begins to consider it. In typical Milan fashion, though, she doesn't take the story in the directions it's first headed, but rather our two main characters have an honest and open conversation much sooner than anticipated. Conflicted over the plight of the greater good and personal success versus being the villain in one woman's story, Oliver decides to find out more about Jane before deciding which way to go.
After the dinner party, their next meeting is on the street, and something happens to unnerve Jane. Quote, "He stopped on the street, tipping his hat to her. And that's when something awful happened." She looked into his eyes. They were ice blue and mobile. In the bright mid-morning, his spectacles made him look sharp and intelligent. He didn't look over her head as if wishing her elsewhere. He didn't curl his lip in disgust or nudge his companion as if to say, "That's her. She's the one I was telling you about." He looked at her straight on, his eyes flickering over her as if he were wondering what lay beneath the blinding orange and green pattern of her day gown. And he smiled at her as if she deserved more than a few scraps of surface civility. She felt something that she'd only read about in the pages of a book. There was a slow prickle in her throat, a flush of heat that slid over her skin. She felt a sense of pure awareness. A frisson. She felt a real live frisson just from looking into his eyes. How dreadful.
Although she immediately tries to disarm him using a tried-and-true trick of misidentification, referring to him as Mr. Cromwell, it seems not to unruffle him one bit. And when she tries to find a connection from his cousin and companion on the street, Sebastian, to a famous and disreputable scientist, Sebastian Mahler, she is the one ruffled, as his cousin is, in fact, Mr. Mahler, and doesn't mind his disreputable reputation one bit. But Oliver believes he has seen through Jane's act and asks Sebastian a simple question to further unmoor Jane. Quote, "Miss Fairfield," Mr. Marshall said, "are you familiar with chameleons?" "I dare say I was just reading about those," Jane said, officiously, trying to regain her balance. "Those are a species of flower?" Mr. Marshall didn't even twitch at that, and that made Jane feel all the more uneasy. He was supposed to smile at her. Better yet, he was supposed to sneer. "Or maybe it was a hat?" she added. "Not so much as a curl of his lip. The chameleon," Mr. Marshall said, "is a species of lizard. It changes its coloration so that it hides in its surrounding. When it darts across the sand, it is sand-colored. When it slips through the forest, it is tree-colored. You," he said, with a small gesture of his hand, "are an anti-chameleon." "I am an ant-eating what?" "An anti-chameleon. The opposite of a chameleon," he explained. "You change colors, yes, but when you are in sand, you fashion yourself a bright blue so that the sand knows you are not a part of it. When you are in water, you turn red so that everyone knows you are not liquid. Instead of blending in, you change so that you can stand out." Jane swallowed hard. "Well, Sebastian," Marshall said, turning back to his friend, "what think you of this sort of adaptation? What kind of creature tries to stand out from its surroundings?" Mr. Mahler frowned and rubbed his forehead as he considered the question. Poisonous ones.
Soon, Oliver gives Jane the opportunity to unburden herself and come clean with her troubles to him. It's an enticing proposition because of the attraction she feels for him and her desperation to share her burden with someone who really does appear to understand her so well. But there's just one caveat. When she asks him if he is telling her the truth, he admits that it's 95% of it. And when she finally does decide to unburden herself to him, he says, quote, "Never trust a man who claims that he is telling you 95% of the truth." And then he continues with the other 5%. "I talked to you because Bradenton asked me to do it." She took a step back involuntarily. "Bradenton? What has he to do with any of this?" "He thinks you need to know your place. He offered me a trade, his vote in Parliament, if I'd deliver a sharp lesson to you. I talked to you to figure out if I could do it."
This leads to more conversation where Oliver divulges much of his past and his plans for the future. Although he didn't go through with this plan, he admits he is the kind of man who considered it, was tempted by it. Jane considers everything. Quote, "I suppose I should be angry, but I'm not really. It doesn't surprise me that you'd want to betray me. Everyone else always does. So there you have it. You might betray me, but you are my favorite betrayer thus far." He made a noise. "You should be angry, Miss Fairfield. You should push me away." "Mr. Marshall, haven't you figured it out? I'm too desperate to be angry." But with that truth established, the two are now primed to figure out a way to beat Bradenton at their own game.
Meanwhile, we have a few different subplot stories going on. We learn about Emily, Jane's sister. She has a seizure condition, and their uncle Titus, who is her guardian, has subjected her to some barbaric experiments in an attempt to cure it. That's why Jane has to be allowed to stay in their house, to bribe any new quacks he brings in to treat Emily so that she isn't subjected to further abuse. Titus believes he is truly doing the best for Emily, but is obviously misguided. Emily, though, is an active young woman who can't stand her mandated bed rest. Eventually, she begins escaping for walks during her naps, and on one of these occasions, she meets a young law student with whom she sparks a connection, a Mr. Anjan Bhattacharya. And I'm sorry, I looked up the pronunciation of that, and I think I'm still butchering it, so apologies if I'm not quite getting that right.
Oliver also visits with his family in Cambridge. His younger sister, Frederica, known as Free, is angry at him for reneging on a promise to tutor her in Greek. And when they reconnect, she seems like she is bursting for something to happen. Oliver is fearful for his sister. She has so many ideas and such strong ideals, and he doesn't think that the world will be kind to her. Quote, "I worry about you," he finally said to Free. "I'm afraid that you're going to break your heart going up against the world." "No," the wind caught her hair and sent it swirling behind her. "I'm going to break the world."
Later, when in London, Oliver also visits his Aunt Freddie, who is Frederica's namesake. She is homebound and doesn't look well to Oliver. She and Free, who have always been close, have butted heads about her refusal to go outside and are no longer talking. Oliver feels the burden of his family's troubles acutely, although he knows there is not much he can do for them all, as they are all adults in their own right.
Another small theme is the Mrs. Larringer books. These books are Gothic novels where Mrs. Larringer takes on the world. Emily is obsessed with them, and Jane smuggles her copies of the latest edition. Oliver finds Jane in a bookshop purchasing one for Emily and snags the first volume before himself even.
But back to Cambridge and Bradenton. Oliver and Jane devise a plan to out Bradenton, which goes off very well. Bradenton is humiliated, and his posse are disgusted about the whole scenario and agree to hear Oliver out about why they should vote for the reform bill. They seem very positive for it by the end of the night. This plan does mean that Jane's cover of being an airhead is blown, but she knows that she will recover and still find a way to repel any suitors. This time with Oliver, the defeat of Bradenton, and the addition of some real friends now that the secret is out, was worth it.
But all of this does not forge a path to a happy ending for our hero and heroine. Oliver still needs a quiet, fits-the-mold sort of wife, and both he and Jane know that she isn't that. Their attraction is strong, but the circumstances have been known since the start. And so they part, with Oliver telling Jane to contact him if she ever needs anything, because they are, after everything, friends.
Months pass. Emily's escapades are discovered and Titus blames Jane. He refuses to let her stay in the house, and Jane shrewdly bargains before agreeing to leave. She will go where he dictates, but he may not allow any doctors to experiment on Emily without consulting Jane first, and without Emily's explicit consent. With a little blackmailing, he agrees.
Oliver is politicking in London broodingly while Jane is repelling new suitors in Nottingham when she hears a whisper. Her aunt has conspired with a particularly repulsive suitor to convince but not compromise Jane into marriage because Titus needs her married fast in order to have Emily committed to an institution. Jane hops into action, sending a telegram to Oliver, only to be interrupted by one of the players in the scenario. She inconspicuously hands it over to be sent incomplete, deciding that regardless of if Oliver comes, she has gotten what she needs out of it. In that moment, she doesn't feel alone, and she feels emboldened to do what she needs to do.
But Oliver receives the partial telegram and immediately leaves, despite the fact that it is totally not his character to do so. He is also compelled. What transpires is a topsy-turvy, trope-filled tableau. First, Jane gets her suitor to pretend to run away with her to Gretna Green. Once in the carriage, she offers to bribe him with £1,000 to continue on by himself so it isn't known that she is headed to Cambridge. However, the villain can do simple maths and knows her dowry is much, much more of a reward. And then Oliver was supposed to meet Jane in an inn, so she knows that someone knows a bit about her whereabouts. Luckily, though, he had actually bribed the driver of the villain's carriage, and after a couple hours' drive, he hops down, informs the villain that he will be spending the night in the carriage, and aways with Jane to an inn.
That night, they have encounter number 1, and the next morning, number 2. Because although Oliver told Jane to get 2 rooms, she takes matters into her own hands and gets 1. She knows they have no future, but they do have a present, and she has told herself that if she ever had the opportunity, she wanted a night with Oliver. However, there is still much more of the story to be told. When they arrive in Cambridge, it turns out that Emily has disappeared, leaving a cryptic note to Titus that included a hidden message to Jane. She said she was going to visit her barrister, which Jane knows to be Mr. Bhattacharya, so she could hunt for him. This leads Oliver and Jane to London.
The reunion and the encounters they have lead to an expression of feelings. Oliver admits to himself that he's in love with Jane, but that she's still his impossible girl. Jane is sad, but has known from the beginning, telling him, quote, "I've had a long time to think it over, and you're right. Marriage between us would be a disaster. I know what I can do and what I can't, and I can pretend to be a great many things, but even if I could act the proper hostess, the sort you'd need, I wouldn't want to do it. I'm done taking on the role of pretender." So they form a truce and decide to enjoy each other's company for the time being. They find out where Emily is, but before all is resolved, Oliver's mother finds them at his hotel to tell him that his Aunt Freddie had died. Before she leaves, she says, "And Oliver, the woman who is staying with you?" Jane froze. "What woman?" "Don't be ridiculous. You're here under an assumed name. You've never used my soap, and yet someone here has washed with my May blend. I smelled it the instant I walked in. I only wanted you to know. There won't be many of us present, just family and a few others. If she's important to you, if she would bring you comfort, you should bring her."
And Oliver does decide to invite Jane, but he wants to have her come as his fiancée, because he is in love with her, and if he shares her with his family, he doesn't think he could ever let her go. In fact, he knows that his sister-in-law, who is a duchess, could train her. And with that, the spell is broken. Quote, "Train me," Jane said. "What am I, a horse?" "No, of course not, but a few lessons." "A few lessons on what?" Jane's chin came up, but her lips trembled. "On how to act, on how to behave, how to dress? Is that what you mean?" He couldn't say anything. "Tell me, Oliver, how long do you think it will take me to learn to hold my tongue, to talk quietly, to dress as everyone else does? Jane, if you want to run, marry one. Don't ask me." He shut his eyes. I know. It's such a horrid thing to ask, but..." He paused, trying to regroup, trying to explain. "I've made a career of keeping quiet. Someone from my background has to be particularly careful. My brother can advocate for whatever he wishes. I have to be cautious, to make sure that when people think of me, they think of a reasonable man. Someone who is just like them. Someone who doesn't have an awful wife," Jane said. Her voice was thick. She stood up. "It's just as well, because She stopped biting her lip and then shook her head. No, never mind. You've just been told that your aunt has passed away. I don't need to add to your burdens. Just say it, he snapped, and spare me your pity. Her chin rose. It's just as well you don't want an awful wife, she told him, because I have hoped for a husband with a little courage. Oh, that hurt. He wasn't choosing between acceptance and Jane, between a ballroom filled with happy friendship and that dark road alone with Jane. He was choosing between a dark, lonely road with her and one without her.
So Oliver attends the funeral alone, and Jane goes to reunite with Emily, who, after a couple hurdles, gains permission to marry Anjan. Jane sets herself up in a new residence, rekindles an old friendship from Cambridge, and begins to think about how she wants to spend her inheritance on charity. Perhaps she will establish a research hospital based in scientific principles. The funeral for Freddie is eye-opening. When her will is being read, it appears at first as though she has left Free out of it. Her sisters say they will split their share with her, but the executor stops them, because Free is the last bequest. Quote, Lastly, I come to Frederica Marshall, my goddaughter, niece, namesake, and scourge of my existence. Several years ago, as I am sure you are all aware, she was presumptuous enough to insist that I leave this apartment, that I go out in the world and have an adventure, even if it was so trivial a one as to buy an apple. After she left, I attempted to do so. Free let out a broken breath, so close to a sob. I discovered myself incapable of leaving, the solicitor read. For some reason, I could not fit through the door. But I did my best to make do, and so for that reason, I leave the proceeds of my grand adventure and the contents of my trunk to Miss Frederica Marshall. I suspect that she will make better use of them than I did. Free looked up. Proceeds, she said quietly. What proceeds would she be talking about? Those would be the royalties on 25 volumes published to date, not counting the 4 that are in the process of publication. Frederica blinked. 25 volumes? She repeated. Oliver felt a sudden, staggering pain. He knew which authoress had penned 25 volumes, one after the other in quick succession. His sister walked over to his aunt's trunk, flipped open the lid. She reached inside. Oliver knew, he absolutely knew what he would see in those pages. Mrs. Larriger and the Welsh Brigade, Free read out loud. She took out another sheaf. Mrs. Larriger and the French Comtesse? Mrs. Larriger goes to Ireland? Her voice caught. Who is Mrs. Larriger? But Oliver knew. If his sister sifted through those papers long enough, Mrs. Larriger would find her way to China, to India, across all the seas of the world. He remembered mocking these books with Jane, laughing that the author had clearly gone no farther than Portsmouth. He'd been wrong. The author had not even come that far. She'd lived the majority of her life in scarcely more than 100 square feet, and she'd had so much adventure hidden in her that it had poured out once she'd let it loose.
It is Freddie's death and secrets that shake Oliver enough to get him to reflect on earlier lessons she told him and what he really wants with his life. She had told him that he used to be a coal grabber like Free and his mother, reaching into the hot coals without a thought. But now he had become more reserved and careful like Freddie herself. When had he changed? Why? Quote, how was it that he'd taken the rules that he'd hated and adopted them for himself? He'd chafed when people told him he was a bastard. He raged when they said he would never amount to anything, that his father was nothing. How was it that he was telling the woman that he loved she was nothing, that she was awful? He'd started caring more about becoming the kind of person who could make a change than he cared about the change itself. He loved the person she'd made of him, a man who could foil abductions and break into houses when circumstances required, a man who could take on Bradenton and see a foe to vanquish, not a powerful lord to be appeased. And he'd wanted to make her into nothing because that's what he'd done with himself.
And so, Oliver realizes he needs a grand gesture to convince Jane of his change of heart. He begins with a visit to Bradenton for a final showdown of wits, out-arguing him and securing his subservience and vote. Finally, he heads to Jane's new residence and stuns her upon entry, for he is outfitted in a new waistcoat. A bright, loud, pink silk, the color of one of Jane's most notorious dresses, Fouchine. And then he begins the grovel. He tells her that he was wrong for considering her a blight, that she was right to say he waylaid his courage. He tells her the story of exactly where he lost it, and then continues by telling her that that's why he needs her, because she reminds him of how to find his voice, and he wants to be the one that supports her magnificence without ever asking her to be less.
And with all that truth and honesty, there is no reason for them not to agree to be married. So then we have the epilogue. Oliver and Jane are happily married. Her gowns are still the subject of many conversations, but she is the kind of woman who everyone wants to know. Her charity hospital has gained much acclaim. Jane is considered an asset to Oliver's career, and he knows how lucky he is to have her. She's increasing with their second child, and together they are taking on the world.
A very satisfying ending, I think. But there is so much to discuss with this.
There is.
So shall we quickly adjourn to the parlor?
We shall.
We have a nice, short, sweet parlor for you today with just a quick reminder that if you'd like to find us elsewhere, perhaps on social media, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter at T as in Tom, N as in Nancy Strumpets, Facebook /TN Strumpets, and YouTube by searching our name.
And if you're listening to us on YouTube, now is a great time to click that thumbs up and hit subscribe before you forget. Liking and commenting on our videos and subscribing to our channel is a really wonderful way to let us know that you like what we're doing.
If you'd like to know ahead of time what we're reading each month, you can subscribe to our email notifications on our website. If you subscribe, you're the first to know what we're reading each month, and you get all sorts of extras, including exclusive content from any of the authors that join us on the podcast. Our website is romancepod.com, and there you can find episodes, more information about us, and other resources. So take a look.
Finally, rate, review, and tell a friend. Reviews on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, and anywhere else you can review us really help other listeners find the podcast. And word of mouth is also one of the best ways that podcasts get found. So if you like what you're hearing, we'd love for you to spread the word.
All right, Kelsey. So I finally get to ask, what did you think about this book?
I thought it was really dynamic. There was a lot going on. And I'm pretty sure I read this in not a single sitting, but I definitely started it one night and finished it the next day. Like I blew through it really fast because I was gripped from the get-go. And not just with Jane and Oliver, but with all the side characters too. And in fact,
which is so rare.
Yeah. And in fact, I almost I had to stop myself from immediately reading all the the next two books in the series because I was like, you've got other things to do, Kelsey.
Yes, I didn't really even include Sebastian and Violet. They have a little teaser of them and they're the next book. And I just was like, okay, but they're the least important subplot in this book. I feel like what you get with Free is important to Oliver and what you, and also to Freddie. And those things are really important to me, to this story.
Yeah. And,
so I had to include them.
Oh my God. The reveal that Freddie was Mrs. Larringer, she was the authoress of those books. And I was mind blown. Didn't see that coming at all.
Neither did I, but also as it's about to happen, I see it coming.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And I cried at that scene. There were just moments of realization and Oliver kind of and just, I don't know. It made me cry. It really did. Yeah. This book had brought out so many emotions in me.
No, absolutely. I'm pretty sure I cried after all of that. And just also the way I love the story of Emily and Anjan and how they meet and their story is just so beautiful.
It's so beautiful. But it's like what Courtney Milan does in her novellas.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I don't want any more after her novellas, which is extremely rare. And I felt I didn't feel like Emily and Anjan needed their own book because their story was so complete in this one.
Oh, absolutely. And it was interwoven with this one. And it's just so interesting because it's oh, where is this going to go in and all of this. But I also loved the two twins at the beginning who she's oh, these are my fake friends. They're being awful to me and I'm just letting them and that's okay. And then they become real friends. Like,
yes.
they like protect her and they're like, don't do that. Like, we can't sit by anymore. Something bad's going to happen. We need to protect you. And the other twin becomes like her partner in the charity hospital, like, because she doesn't want to get married. And like, how great is that? Like, they actually are true friends at the end.
Yeah, it turns out that the twins that she was friends with, fake friends with, were actually using her just as much as she was using them. But when they all become honest with each other, they, realize that they have everything in common and they are real friends. And it's so wonderful because I feel like this book does exactly that so many times, which is it takes tropes and flips them on their head. And I mean, that's just what Courtney Milan does. I said that about The Devil. What was the one she took out this year? The Devil. Oh my God. There's too many devil books.
When the Devil Comes Calling.
The Devil Comes Calling. Yes. That one. I said the same thing, like that it takes tropes and what you expect, and she does something completely unexpected with it. And so like that happened again, like the evil friends, you know, and flips it on its head. It's the book starts with this trope of like, he's going to humiliate her. So you think that, okay, he's going to humiliate her, but then somehow at the end, like, they're going to overcome that. That's going to be the thing they have to overcome. But no, of course not. That is way too mean and simple for Courtney Milan to write.
Exactly. Too simple. The fact that there's kind of multiple villains, but each villain really isn't the villain in their sense. Like, Bradenton's real irritation with Jane isn't that she needs to be put in her place. It's that she refused his suit because he needed her money and he wanted to marry her, and she blatantly refused him. And then like, so he was more annoyed at the fact that she refused him and wanted to like make her regret that decision. And then the uncle truly does think he's doing best by Emily. He really does. He really does. And yes, he's an idiot and, has his moral righteousness that's led him to do all the wrong things, but he really truly doesn't believe. And even Jane's like, oh, you're not actually a villain. I truly believe you want to help her. The problem is you've just been doing it wrong.
Yeah, you're completely misguided. Like, I get that you're coming from a place of like, living your truth, but your truth is really wrong. And also, this book feels really relevant to like a lot of things going on today, politically, medically. A lot of the same themes are just, a history repeats itself. And I just felt like there were a lot of moments in this book that just felt very familiar. But yeah, to kind of go back to those villains, I felt like they were all multidimensional. And that's another thing that Courtney Milan's so great at, is she doesn't really write for most of her things, it's not black and white. No. There's a lot of gray, and there's kind of that moral ambiguity in some ways. And she doesn't tell you what is right or wrong, but she lays out a series of facts and again, lets you as the reader come to your own conclusion. And I've said exactly that about her before. And that's why I think she's my favorite author. Like, I love her. And then as far as the tropes are concerned too, like, I was thinking about this today, like Jane's dresses. I didn't talk about them that much, but Jane's dresses are awful and Jane loves them. Jane she loves her dresses. And like, when she gets married and in subsequent books, like there's some mention about like she actually becomes a bit of a trendsetter because she's ostentatious, I would say, but kind of, and a little bit garish, but she's one of those people that pushes the limits and kind of sets fashion rather than lets fashion be dictated to her. I think
the pink dress you talk about is the fact that like, it's actually like a very demure gown. It doesn't have any ornamentation on it. Like, it's just vibrantly pink.
And a new dye that no one else has used, and certainly not in that quantity. Yeah. So, but she's just, I love her. And
when she talks about the science of the dye, though, she's like researched it and she's like, wait till you see this other one. It's this green color called this,
Well, and that's one of her knowledge of dyes and talking about dyes actually ends up being a really important breakthrough in the next book for one of the scientists. So anyhow,
brilliant.
Like, it all is connected. It's all connected. Yeah. It's so great. So I do want to say, though, thinking about those the gowns and the garishness and her just being this, you know, like too much instead of the wallflower to hide from suitors. I feel like it's also flipping the plain Jane trope on its head. Like, I think there is something a little cheeky about Courtney Milan naming this character Jane, right? Because we've talked about this before. We've had some Janes that we've read that have been the plain Jane trope, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I really do wonder if she chose that name to kind of, again,
flip it on its head.
Yeah.
That's an insight I wouldn't have thought of, Zoe, but I think that's totally accurate because she is like, her whole thing is like, I'm loud. I'm obnoxious to look at, not just to talk to.
So I want to talk about, though, why I really wanted to talk about this book, because I credit this book with being, I think, my biggest source of growth as a reader and maybe even as a person. So I read this book. This is probably the fourth or fifth time that I've read this book. And the first time I read this book was many years ago. It was one of the first historical romances I think that I read kind of early in my time. So whenever we were working together, I don't remember what year that was, but probably 10 years ago.
Something like that.
Something like that. And this was the first plus size character that I had read. And when I read that, I immediately was super uninterested. Didn't like this book. I didn't like Jane. Didn't like anything. Didn't like this book. Years later, picked it up again because I was rereading the series. And it was like I was disappointed in myself. I was ashamed of myself because, you know, that's certainly not how one should see things. And maybe I shouldn't have been ashamed of myself. Maybe I should have been, again, more, you know, more ashamed or angry at society for making me feel that if I didn't read a book about an absolutely ideal, whatever patriarchal shaped woman was, then I wasn't into it. Like, I don't know. And I'm just so glad that I no longer feel that way, that I no longer feel like that there is, that for me, I only have to read about an idealistic patriarchal body type, you know, and it's just like, I don't even know how to completely unpack my immaturity around that, but I'm just really grateful because it is really a stark contrast for me to look at that book and know what I thought about it the first time I read it and how just, I don't know how blindered, like I just had blinders on, right? Like I only thought one thing, and I've grown, I've matured, and I see it from a completely different thing. Like, first of all, Jane is beautiful. Second of all, she's fierce. She's amazing. Like, there's just so many things. I don't know. There's just so many things that are great about Jane. And I would love to talk about all of them more. But before we jump out of our general thoughts and into our specifics, there is one thing I wanted to mention. This book is chock-a-block full of diversity and representation.
100%. I was reading it and I was like, oh my God, this is wild. Like,
and it feels
all over
again,
the place.
So natural. Like and what makes me crazy also is that when I read this years and years ago, none of that stuck with me. Like, none of it stuck with me. And like, where now, you know, I keep championing any book that has like any sort of diversity in it because I want more books like that. And I'm like, but Courtney Milan's been doing this all along.
Yeah.
No wonder I loved her. And I just didn't even see any of that then, you know, but I guess I was also reading a book a night and just reading. Anyhow.
Yeah.
It's really great
it's
because
really
you've got Anjan and Emily, you know, and Emily has a disability. Anjan is Indian. You've got Freddie, who also has, you know, a mental disability. She has what do you call it? Agoraphobia. Yes. They mentioned that Oliver's sister Patricia is married to a Jew, and also you have Genevieve, the other twin, who I wonder if she is either a lesbian or asexual, but she does not want to be touched by men.
No, she even says, she's like, the idea of marriage itself isn't bad, but I just have no desire to have intimate knowledge of a man. and I don't want them to have intimate knowledge of me. Like that, the thought of that is abhorrent to me, and I don't want that.
Yeah. And everything is just like, I don't know, everything is just so well done in that respect. But shall we talk a little bit more about Jane?
Let's talk about Jane. I will say you get the idea of Jane like right from the get-go, where she's talking, like the twins are there and they're like, oh yes, that lace looks great. Oh God. And you see she's like, and I'm looking at the seamstress and she just looks at me like, oh God, no, not more, not more. less is more. Yep. No, more is more. And Jane's like, bring that gold lace trim over here. I think that would look great right here, right there. And so you get the idea right from the get-go that she has her own ideas about it. Like, she's smart, she's clever. And the more you get to know her, you kind of get to see more of that cleverness and sharpness. And it's not the cleverness I think they're expect. A lot of times in the romances, when you expect a clever heroine, it's like they have to be like brilliantly smart. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's not that Jane is brilliantly smart. She is, you know, very clever and smart and witty, but she's also just doing things out of necessity. It'd be interesting to see who Jane would have become without this necessity.
Yeah.
But she realizes that in pretending, she was no longer pretending anymore. Like, there is a level of her that was like, she maybe would be less outspoken. She'd make less dumb quips, things like that. More, there's, you know, a great scene I have in like my favorite quotes where she blatantly insults someone and does it so nicely and so like, well, what do you mean? You know, like, you know, those are not things that Jane would actually say. That is a bit of her character that she puts on. But at the same time, too, she's like, she tells Ollie, she's like, I like my gowns, actually. At some point, I realized I freaking love them. And I love that I wear whatever I want and no one says anything to me.
Yeah. Yeah, she's just so vibrant. I mean, she just jumps off the page from the beginning. And I mean, even this time around, you know, you start reading her and you go like, oh God, this girl. But even though like she's kind of frustrating, you love her. Like you just, I don't know. I just love her from the get-go. And I love her bold gowns. And I love that it's this woman who can't get married, but isn't just hiding or like, you know, trying to, it's not like she's going to emerge, you know, from as a swan because she was an ugly duckling. Like she was wearing glasses and all of a sudden now she's going to be beautiful because she took her glasses off. It's like, hello, here I am. Don't you want me? Like, I love that about her. And it's so different. It's so different. Like I don't think I know a book that does the same thing, like the same trope with success. Like I don't think I've ever read one. I love her. And I love that she's a protector and she uses whatever she has to her advantage, you know? And you're right. She's very smart. She's extremely smart. She just has barely had any opportunities to put her brain to use. And she's had very little formal education. So who's to say that she, you know, isn't excellent at, you know, something, but she can hold her own in a conversation for sure. And she's very, very good at strategy. Like that's what Jane excels at. And that's why, like, I think as a reader, you see from the beginning, like, well, actually, Oliver, she'd make you an excellent wife as a politician's wife because she's so good with strategy. And like, you guys can talk about this all the time and she's going to help. And anyhow.
Well, but I love it even too, because even without Oliver, she's like, I have all this money. I don't want to get married. I don't need to get married. Like, I'm not being forced now to even pretend. Like, I can just not get married. The only man I would marry, I can't marry. I'm not going to. So, and said, she's like, what do I do with all my money? I have a lot of money. I don't know what to do with it. She's like, okay, let's start a charity project, you know? And she taps Genevieve to like help her with the project. She's like, what would we need to do to get this started to help? Because, and her hospital, it becomes a place for people such as Emily who have illnesses that aren't well known and aren't curable, but gives them a safe place where they can actually consult with physicians and be on and get access to state-of-the-art, technology and cures without it being quack medicine.
Yeah, which in Victorian England, there was still, today there's still a lot of quack medicine.
Yes.
But especially then, but there was also, a real scientific revolution going on. So there were discoveries happening every day. And in fact, one of the doctors that Emily sees in the book was a real doctor. This is part of the author's note. Mm-hmm. And he was the leading expert on epilepsy. And he declared her not to be an epileptic in the book because that was his belief at the time. However, we know now that Emily does have a form of epilepsy. It's just a more mild form that wasn't understood at the time. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, she did have the best care available, but she also had the worst care available. And there wasn't any sort of standard for that. And during that period and soon after, I think that was when standards started to become important.
Yes.
Anyhow, thanks, Jane, for getting that started.
Mm-hmm.
I love Jane. I love what she did for me too as a reader, just my growth and realizing how awesome she was. So I'm ready to rate her. How about you?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to give Jane a 10. There's nothing more I could ask from her.
I've been thinking about that because I was just thinking about it and I was I haven't really ascribed a number to everything. And now I'm just kind of well, I really have no fault with her. I was never annoyed at any point during the book. I agreed with all of Jane's choices. I didn't think she could have made better choices in any way, shape, or form based on the path she set for herself. So yeah, I'm going to give her a 10. She wasn't annoying. She was clever. She was smart. I agreed with everything she did. I really felt for her in the times where she was stuck and needed to figure out how to get out where she was stuck and needed to help Emily as well as, still help herself. So I'll give her a 10 too.
So now Oliver. Oliver, I think, is an interesting study because reading this book in the beginning, I also kind of had forgotten a little bit about it. And I forgot about the Bradenton thing. And I was like, he's going to what? And then I was like, no, okay. It's Courtney Milan. She's not going to mishandle me like that. But you really don't, there are moments where I really don't like Oliver and then there are just these really romantic moments where he's wonderful with his family, or when there's a scene where he tells Jane to keep talking, when she's talking too much and she's like, oh, I should just stop talking. And he goes, keep talking, Jane. And it's just so, as a very verbose person who's had a hard time keeping his mouth shut at appropriate moments.
Who's been told to stop talking.
Yeah, and I think many women feel that way. To be told to keep talking is extremely empowering. So Oliver, he just would get me every time.
I think that my thing with Oliver is looking at him is there were some again, I never felt truly annoyed with Oliver. I was frustrated with Oliver. But at the same time, too, I think what you really saw was Oliver, who felt very assured in who he was, suddenly have to question those things. Mm-hmm. And so I really do feel like you see more growth in Oliver in the sense that he knows what he desires and he knows what he wants. And then he has to decide if he's a person that's literally willing to do anything to get what he wants. And in that process, that's the whole, are you willing to ruin this woman to get your votes, to get what you need? And at the time, he's worried. He doesn't see the option. But then he does decide to get to know Jane, to figure out if it's worth that price. And decides it's not. But I think that within that questioning is how you get Oliver the person in that sense. And you get him as that wonderful hero because he has those growth and he does have those challenges. And one thing, as we say with this, is there's really no main villain. It's not like Oliver has to overcome his emotional distress or vanquish the enemy. One of the villains, you could say, in this book is Oliver's own understanding of the world and his, deep-seated fears and his own, what's the word I'm looking for?
Hesitations.
His own hesitations, as well as his own eventual, the breaking of Oliver, in the sense he tells a story about being at school and how actually it was not the kids who broke him, it was a teacher, who basically just told him to shut up and sit down, shut up and sit down, shut up and sit down. And he finally gave in and was like, that's what I have to do to make a difference. And then,
in a way, he decided to weaponize that himself, like Jane did with her faults. He said, okay, well, if you're going to make me shut up and sit down, then I'm going to weasel my way from the bottom and get through all the cracks.
Yeah.
But I think you were going to get, or that, I think you were getting to, is that he realizes at the end that that's not the only way he can do things anymore.
Mm-hmm. Self-esteem. That was the word I was searching for so long. His self-esteem was really wrecked by that teacher too.
Wrecked, for sure. I mean, and we've all had moments where we've been told to shut up. And I'm sure that I think any person has probably had at least one moment in their life where that happened. And it is extremely humiliating and can be extremely a big hit to your self-esteem. However, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said. And then there's that chapter where he sorts all this out in his head. Mm-hmm. That whole chapter where he sorts that out. And I think we have a quote from it in the notes where he kind of realizes all these things. Like, I have made myself into what I, set out to change. Mm-hmm. I've made myself into the thing that I hated.
Yeah.
What, how, why, what, and then also Jane is going against the mold. And that's what I started, that's what I set out to do in the beginning. And I'm telling her she needs to change and conform. No, I want to make changes. And it's just that chapter, I literally, after reading it, I was like, this was a triumph of a chapter, because any hesitations I had about Oliver were so laid to rest in his thoughts and his realizations just after that chapter. I just felt like he figured things out.
I agree.
It all makes sense. Okay, Oliver, you get a 10 from me.
He gets a 10 from me too. Again, it was a 10. It was a slow 10, but I think the growth is there and the person he becomes is there. And there's nothing I would say, again, there was never something that I thought was a red flag. There was never a absolutely not, okay, he got a little better for me. It was like, okay, you could do better, Oliver. Oh, look, you're doing better.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, it's also sometimes we feel like there's that je ne sais quoi, right? That thing that makes someone a 10, because we're there's that little bit of spark of attraction to them. And to me, there's none of that factoring into his 10. I just think he's such a perfect character, regardless of my attraction to him, as a hero. He's just, there's nothing more I could ask from him. It's such an interesting arc. Yeah,
it's really funny because when they describe Oliver, and I have a hard time picturing Oliver. He's basically a bright redhead with glasses, and I'm like,
yeah,
okay.
I know, it's so funny. Well, we're on to our favorite quotes.
I have a couple. I just loved them. So one is, it's a long one, which is basically where you learn about Jane. It's when Oliver is meeting Jane the first time. And this is that beautiful, insult that Jane gave that it took a minute to realize it was an insult. I must have misunderstood you. In the lexicon of English gentlemen, a language of euphemism and false politeness, this was one of the more stinging insults. I must have misunderstood you, usually translated into, hold your tongue. Oliver steepled his fingers and tried to look anywhere but at the two. Miss Fairfield didn't seem the least troubled. Did you misunderstand me? She asked in tones of solicitousness. I'm so sorry. I should have realized the sentence construction was too complex for you. She leaned toward him and spoke again, this time raising her voice and slowing her words as if she was talking to an aging grandfather. What I meant was that I had not thought you were intelligent. That would make the study of the physical world difficult. Whitting turned red. But that is... Perhaps I am wrong, she said cheerily. Do you enjoy the study of the physical world?
I love all of her insults. She's so good at them. And there's another book that's familiar to me where the person is like really good at insults, but people don't realize that they're insulting them. I wonder if it'll come back to me. Jane is not like that because Jane is acting intentionally oblivious, but like no one can eat. Oh, it's Lady Danbury, right? Like she can insult people or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But or maybe it's even Lady Whistledown kind of is the things in my brain. But yeah, but Jane, like they can't imagine that she's smart enough to even understand that she's breaking the rules, you know? So it's so great being an insider and knowing that she is actually quite smart and using that to her advantage. Do you have another one?
Oh, I've got another one.
Nice.
This one isn't Jane or Oliver or any. This is just a good moment. Again, we talk about the diversity in this book. So here we go. Lyrington looked at Emily, really looked at her, and then turned his head to look at Anjan. Batty, he said slowly, I do believe you've been holding out on me. Across the table, Emily grimaced again and slapped her hand against the table. The name, she said primly, is Bhattacharya, and since it's going to be mine, you had best learn to pronounce it properly.
I love that moment with Emily, although I will say, as we probably are butchering it a little bit, it's sorry if we are, but man, I love that. And I love when she meets Anjan's mother and she has that line to her where she's like, the mother says something like, he told you he just told you to agree with whatever he wants. She said, no, he told me that I agree with whatever you want. Or no, he didn't tell me. She says like, she says, no, I don't agree with whatever he wants. I agree with whatever you want. And the mom was like, you told her that. And he says, I did not tell her that. She figured all that out on her own.
Oh my God. And that's the thing about this book. And again, like we said, those little side stories where you get like the full picture, like Emily and Anjan have a full story. You get Emily meeting Anjan's mother for the first time and you get them discussing what it's like because he's going to be marrying a non-Indian girl. You know, she does have seizures. That is a concern, and very much you get to see that family dynamic and understand it and see how Emily's going to fit in and how she will have that happy ending because the whole family will accept her, not just, Emily's family accepting him.
Yes. Well, I have a quote that I think is really awesome. So I'm going to read it now.
Okay.
You think me dry tinder, Jane said, vulnerable to the slightest spark. You're afraid to send me up in flames because you think that once I am burnt out, there will be nothing left but desolation. She looked up at him as if daring him to contradict her. He couldn't. He'd thought something very much like that just a moment ago, but the look on her face was brighter than any he'd ever seen, and he felt something coil in him in anticipation. I have something to tell you, she whispered, and he leaned in to hear her secret. I am not a blight. I am not a pestilence, and I refuse to be a piece sacrificed for the greater glory of your game. You are not any of those things, he said. What are you then? I am a blaze, she told him.
That was such a good moment. Such a good moment.
And again, this book is many years old, but how bombshell is it? Like when she says like,
very bombshell.
I will, what does she say? Detonate. When it's Jane saying like, I am so strong and I am not going to fall apart. I'm going to set this whole thing on fire. And like, I don't know. There were so many things in this book with Jane that really made me feel like Jane was a big inspiration to Cecily of Bombshell. They're very different characters, but I feel like that there's a lot of kindred spirit between the two of them.
Mm-hmm. And I will say this is great because in the quote we read in the synopsis, she's like, I don't want to be a wren. You need a wren. And then, there's another line where basically he says, you're not a wren, you're a phoenix. And I'm like, yes, she is a phoenix.
There are literally so many quotes from this book. Again, I love Courtney Millan's writing. I included a lot of quotes. I would love to share a billion others, hilarious ones, heartfelt ones. Read the book. Just listeners, just read the book.
Yeah, I mean, you put so many good ones in the synopsis. And again, like I had some other ones. And that like, for me, sometimes I highlight just little things that just like, it's a serious moment and yet they make me giggle.
I had some LOLs, like actual laugh out louds with this book.
Yeah.
Oh, so good. Well, let's try to wrap up this thing because we're going a little long today because this book's so great to talk about. But we have a few more segments, and the next one is our steaminess rating and encounter counter. I'm pretty sure there were 3. It might have just been 2 explicit ones and 1 non-explicit, but there were about 3.
Sounds about right.
And I remember thinking it was steamy. It was a nice hot cup of tea. Like Jane was really like, I'm taking what I want, and they had a great time doing it.
Yes, I agree. It was a good cup of tea. It didn't feel like it felt very appropriate with the rest of the book. For
sure.
You know how we say sometimes like, it's like the rest of the book is kind of demure and then the sex scene's like, well, bam, in your face. And you're like, doesn't fit with what I know.
No.
Or sometimes it's like the book is super hot and bothered, like that sexual chemistry is just leaping off the page, and then this actual like coming together is kind of like
Yep. But this one, just right.
Yes.
So again, this one, the feminist recap does not work for this because this is like such a feminist book. So I wanted to pose a different question to us, which is like, what did this book make you feel? And I have lots of things that this book made me feel. So I felt like this book made me feel so many different emotions. Like, I mean, I already said I cried. I laughed out loud. But it really made me feel empowered. Like these moments of Jane, like the Ablaze moment, obviously I felt so empowered. The moments where Oliver told Jane to keep talking, like that resonated so deeply with me. Like, you know, I felt like this book had a couple of big themes, which was standing up for the little guy and finding your voice, right? Like a lot of us have been told to be quiet. And I think it's particularly interesting knowing some of Courtney Millan's personal history. It seems like these are themes that she likes to write because I think that they're personal to her. But also having empathy for others who are not like you. You know, there's moments of that you see with Freddie's story and Anjan and Emily's stories. And not that someone has to have a thing to be different than you. You know, I think even Jane and Oliver, they have empathy for each other, for each other's differences. And I think like how our differences make us stronger. At the end, you know, Oliver and Jane are stronger together. You know, they complement each other, and the fact that they have so many differences. So anyhow, I really felt like this book made me really want to sit down and reflect on the themes and, you know, what it set out to do and the morals and the, you know, like this feels like a really important work to me. I don't know. Again, it's personal, I think, to me, just because of my history with this book. But I feel like this book made me feel everything.
Agreed. And I think that for me, it was seeing the interactions of the characters, you know, especially like the important ones, like Oliver's, you know, and you know, Oliver is, you know, really good friends with his half brother. Like they are brothers truly, not just half brothers who met. Like they, and you know, immediately there's a moment where Oliver's like, I don't know about this. And his brother's like, what do you need me to do? What can I do? I'm a dude. Like, let me do it for you, you know? And he's like, you can't do it for me, but thank you. And, you know, it's that caring. It's Sebastian coming to the rescue and helping. It's the twins not being the monsters that you think they are. It's Hapford, you know, the Earl who doesn't really like what his cousin or his uncle is doing, you know, and is happy to help Oliver take his uncle down a peg. It's all of those things combined. It's, you know, and all of it in that sense. It's hearing Anjan's voice and hearing him talk about how he didn't really like the nickname Baddie, but kind of understood it because people's pronunciation was kind of shitty. But at least they were calling him something that wasn't in insults or anything like that. It's like he kind of could accept it, but you also felt him feel a little like annoyed at it at the same time.
Yeah, you feel the struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and again, that's a perfect example of Courtney Milan doing what I say she does so well, which is not telling you the answer, but giving you enough facts so that you can form your own opinion. And I think that our opinion was that it felt wrong. It felt wrong that they couldn't say his name. And it felt good when he had someone on his side to stand up for him, because people are not always in a situation where they can raise their voice because of factors, shall we just say. It just depends.
Yeah.
And it was, so basically she put all those things on the page and kind of, gave you his thoughts and feelings and let you work it out yourself. And it's all the better for it as a reader.
Absolutely. So we asked a question, but I do like when we say, is it a feminist supporter or neutral? It is a resounding supporter, as we've said. So when it is a resounding supporter, it's I like that we can say, what did it make us feel?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I think that's a better way to explore talking about the books. Because this one made me feel, I walked away from this book, feeling really good. And also like my heart was heavy, but uplifted. There was just, when you read something really good that makes you think and it's just everything you love. I mean, I don't know. Again, I can't ask for more, which is why my final book rating for this book is a 10. Yeah,
I'll give it a 10 as well.
This is a great book.
I was like really tempted to give it a 9.5, and I'm like, no, it really is a 10. It's got everything. There was no annoying part. You love all the characters. I was just reflecting on like Freddie having to pass away, and I'm like, why did she have to pass away? She's so great.
Yes, but because the Mrs. Larager stories it's all the more sweet. Anyhow, I know. This book is such a good book.
But I just love that coming together. It's like, what part of these books are going to play in this? And
again, this is the 4th or 5th time I've read this. So listeners, if you listened to us talk about this book and read the whole synopsis about this book and you still haven't read this book, go read this book. I cried still knowing what was coming. This is such an expertly, beautifully written book.
No, you could know what's coming, but the journey there is really remarkable, I will say.
I can't agree more. And I'm so glad you liked it. And I'm so glad you hadn't read it.
I know, right? It's so weird. I was like, I've read the 3 others in the series and not this one. What the?
Yeah. So the other ones in the series, we actually did the novella about Oliver's parents as an episode back in the day. I think it's like episode 8. And the next book in the series is their friends Sebastian and Violet. And then you do get Free's book. So if you thought Free was an interesting character, and I have often called Free's book my favorite book ever in this genre.
I know you've said that. And so it's very interesting because when you made the choice with this, and then I looked up and I was like, oh, but the Suffragette Scandal, Zoe loves that book. Why did she not want to do that one?
I know. I have to read that one again. I actually just started The Countess Conspiracy, which is number 3. And I would like to say to anyone who has not read the series yet, I'm going to give a trigger warning for number 3 of miscarriage. So if you are in any part of a fertility journey, you may find that book a little difficult to read. However, it's a wonderful, wonderful book as well. I love that. I love that book as well. Like those series. And then the 5th book is a novella that is called Talk Sweetly to Me, and it features a Black heroine. So I definitely want to reread that one. I've only ever read it once. I don't have much memory about it. So I think I'm doing a full reread here.
Well, that's okay because I'm definitely going to pick up number 3.
It's so good.
After I finished writing up our synopsis for our book that we're talking about next time.
Yes, which is a book that you were excited to read. And now I'm looking forward to discussing with you because it is Scandalous Desires by Elizabeth Hoyt.
Yes. This is our 3rd Maiden Lane book.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting into some things that we saw in the first book that I was more interested in than the actual first book.
Well, Me too. Well, thank you all so much for listening. Please go read The Heiress Effect. It's great. And join us again next time as we read Scandalous Desires by Elizabeth Hoyt.
And may all your ever afters end happily.